and to welcome everybody here. So, to this, event sort of brought together by SDSN Ireland, which was initially thought to be a members event, but then we tagged into SDG Week in Ireland. So it kind of opened up to a broader group of community. And then also, I think there's going to be a group of students here, possibly from UCC Sociology for Sustainable Development module. So welcome to everybody here, and welcome to our broader SDSN colleagues who might be joining us. I know we have Portugal on the line. Just to let you know that this is being recorded, and if we have everything works right technically, I'll be putting it up on SDSN Ireland's YouTube channel. And just to say real quickly that this event is really a synthesis and thinking forward. Where do we go from here? As a result of some the UN Summit of the Future that just happened in New York City, as well as the pre-summit events at the UN and hosted by SDSN at Columbia University. So we'll be tying these together, and what does that mean moving forward, and specifically, in the Irish context. So I think with that, I'd just like to move on with the introduction of our first speaker, who's always a delight to have with us, is former Ambassador David Donoghue, who was the Irish ambassador at the time and the key negotiator for the 2030 agenda and its SDGs. But what I think often falls under the radar is his involvement in the Good Friday Agreement. And at that point in time, and he is the author of a book, One Good Day, My Journey to the Good Friday Agreement, which I would highly recommend as a read. So anyway, I'd like to turn it over to David, who is also chair of SDSN Ireland's Executive Committee. David, to you.
Thank you very much, John. Great pleasure to be here, and welcome to Marie-Jean and other colleagues from outside Ireland, and as well as to all the Irish colleagues. So in the short time that I have, I thought I would try and give a quick overview of the Summit of the Future, but in particular, as John says, where we go to from here. And I'll talk just in a very brief way about the side event called Peace Not War, which Ireland and Colombia hosted at on the margins of the summit, and I'll probably be leaving it to Paul and others to go into detail about the SDSN events. But so very briefly, the Summit of the Future, I mean, for those who are not familiar with the background, this came about really going back to 2020, when the Secretary General wanted to show that the UN was responding well, in the short term to the shocks created by the pandemic, but also there were things on his agenda which he wanted to prioritize. And so out of that came a document called Our Common Agenda. And within that, then he envisaged that there would be a summit in due course, which would take decisions on a range of issues which are in a sense diverse, but they all could be seen as assisting in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So obviously one key theme is how to improve the UN's peacemaking or peace brokering capacity. Another is how to take advantage of new technologies such as AI, but recognizing both the opportunities but also the risks. A third would be how to improve access to finance for sustainable development. A fourth would be how to create stronger intergenerational equity or intergenerational responsibility. This has been a theme at the UN for a number of years, spearheaded indeed by our former president, Mary Robinson, but this was the first time that all 193 member states took a position on this. So these were 5 or 6 priorities which the Secretary General wanted to push, and that's how the Summit of the Future came about. I should say that there was initially a little bit of unease on the part of developing countries who were afraid that the SDGs would end up being somehow marginalized by this exercise. This was absolutely not the Secretary General's intention, and I think after intensive discussions with them, they were reassured. They realized that, in fact, the Summit of the Future would end up addressing the how of the SDGs rather than the what, and indeed that it would give a valuable impetus to the SDGs implementation. And that's, in fact, is how it all worked out. So Germany and Namibia were the two countries who were asked to lead the negotiations on the outcome document, which is called the Pact of the Future. A pretty good document was eventually achieved at the last moment, it must be said, but that's often the way it is in UN negotiations. There was a complication relating to Russia. Again, nothing very unusual at the UN, but Russia took exception to what it saw as an attempt to give civil society an involvement in implementation of this pact. And it is true that the document does envisage the participation of stakeholders in the implementation of the pact. And obviously, from our perspective, that is a very good thing. But Russia, having, of course, its own grievances and difficulties with other member states at the moment, chose to make an issue of this. Happily, Russia did not succeed. In fact, an interesting development was that the African group, of all groups, in effect challenged Russia on this. I'm simplifying the procedural side of it, but a move by the ambassador of Congo, of the DRC, ended up defeating the Russian effort, and the result is that the document was passed. Now, whether it is to be seen as a consensus document, the lawyers can argue over that, but effectively I think it is, and it can be so represented. But technically Russia did not vote in favor, and there were a couple of its allies like Belarus. But leaving that aside, it has the overwhelming support of the other member states. So I think we can describe it effectively as a consensus document. So it is going down well. I mean, it could be argued a lot of the language is fairly general, and there are relatively few new big ideas, that in a sense it's restating the obvious. But there's still a lot that we can use as a basis for moving forward. And in particular, when I look at what's coming up later or next year, there is, for example, a Finance for Development conference which will be hosted in Spain in June, and that will be an important opportunity to take forward the chapter of the pact which relates to development finance, at the role of the IFIs, what can be done to give developing countries, in particular the poorer developing countries, greater access to finance for implementation of the SDGs. How can we equip the world to respond better to shocks which arise? So there are many good things in the pact which focus on the huge needs in relation to development finance, but the summit next June, I think, will be an early opportunity to take that forward in detail. In the peace building area, there are a number of good intentions expressed, and there will be a review of the UN's peace building resources, and that should help. Now, obviously, the UN cannot itself prevent countries going to war, but it can do a lot to assist with early warning of problems or of tensions which are arising. It can also strengthen its own mediation capacity. It can increase the peace building fund, which is designed to create capacity for countries to cope with increasing problems of insecurity. So there's a lot that the UN can do, even though it could not have prevented, we'll say, Russia invading Ukraine, or couldn't have prevented what Israel has done, or indeed what Hamas did. But the UN, on the whole, needs to show that it's relevant to peace. I think that's one of the big challenges coming out of the summit. Maybe I'll move just quickly to the side event which we hosted. That was called Peace Not War, and really what we and Colombia wanted to do was to highlight the peace aspect of the Pact of the Future. We wanted to remind people of how important peace is as almost a precondition for, or at least a key factor in achieving sustainable development. Put it another way, without peace, we have very little of achieving, very little chance of achieving lasting development. So now more than ever, this is a message which has to go out, and our side event, I think, was useful in that it highlighted the success which both Colombia and Ireland have had in their own peace processes, which have in turn enabled development, investment, the expansion of the economies in both countries. So in a way, we were directing attention to the potential of peace as a means of accelerating sustainable development. I think beyond that, I mean, especially with Marie-Joan and others being present, I'll just refer briefly to one of the SDSN events, which was the Leadership Council of the SDSN. And this is a very valuable annual event hosted by Jeff Sachs. He brings together the members of the council a few days before the annual ministerial week at the UN. On this occasion, he had quite a big agenda. He proposed a big agenda, obviously focusing on the summit of the future, what it was likely to achieve, but also looking ahead a little bit. And for me, one of the more interesting debates is what is going to come in 2030 after the SDGs. Strictly speaking, we are not supposed to get into a debate on that formally until 2027. But I think de facto a debate is already beginning. The reason for the 2027 timing is that the developing countries are worried that if there is premature talk about a new agenda to replace the SDGs, that there will be less attention paid to actually achieving the present SDGs. So therefore, to reassure them, 2027 has been agreed as the point at which formally the UN would begin to look at the next agenda. But as I say, de facto, I think it will already happen. And I'll reserve maybe until the Q&A, John, my own views on that, but it was part of the SDSN consideration, what will come next, as it were. And Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, intervened quite in an interesting way on that. Okay, John.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that are coming to mind now, you could go ahead and enter them in the chat, either the chat stream or there's a Q&A feature that's been enabled. So thank you, David. And one thing I'd just like to interject real quickly is, I thought it was a pretty profound thought that occurred, during this Summit of the Future, is we almost need to think synonymously of peace and security, and maybe we should be thinking of those as different entities, which I thought was an interesting perspective. So right now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and actually it'll be two speakers together. It'll be Patrick Paul Walsh from, he's a professor of international development at University College Dublin. He's also director of their Masters in Sustainable Development and vice president of the SDG Academy, which is a function of SDSN Global. And also joining him will be Anne Dolan from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, I believe. And Mary is a very interesting individual who's doing a lot of practical work with developing books to help with aspects of ESD, climate literacy, global citizenship education. And I think if I read this rightly, sort of primarily focused, or at least the base discipline was geography and geoliteracy, but has really branched out into larger focus of sustainability in general. So I'll leave it to you. And I guess, the one thing I would be really interested too is, in the course of things, if you could get a little bit onto how the synergies that may exist between SDSN Ireland and the SDG Academy and how that could be developed further. But ultimately, how this all ties into the Summit of the Future in the SDSN events. So you're muted, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Yeah, it's just a few thoughts. I don't have a lot of time, so I do think it is important that when we look at the Summit of the Future, that we have to think about it in the context of our common agenda, and that's let's say a work program from 2021 to 2025. And it really, to me, there was always a bit of an issue, particularly with the HLPF, that the HLPF would focus on goals and potentially a subset of goals, along with SDG 17 every year, the partnership goal. And some folks say, yeah, but there's some work being done on education and partnerships and finance, what we call the means of implementation. And of course, the Partnership Forum or the Youth Forum or the Finance for Development meetings, they were considered subcommittees of the HLPF. And in some ways, when I looked at the common agenda, what was really happening, Secretary General wanted to turbocharge, if you like, the momentum towards achieving the SDGs. Unfortunately, it was at the time, it was underfunding maybe from America that was starting a problem, but then we had COVID, then we had the geopolitics, so things have got worse and worse. But the focus on these enablers or capacity builders was really what our common agenda is really about. So it shouldn't really interfere in some ways with the overall SDG project. It's just getting the governance right, getting education and capacities right, getting finance right, and peace, so we can have focus on sustainable development. So it was these enablers. So in that context, I guess, when you were looking at the Pact for the Future and particularly looking for education outcomes, you could be disappointed. And in some ways, just the digital Annex 1 on the digital compact seemed to have more about digital skills and education and training. It was very STEM focused really, and about kind of the contribution of the possibilities that online and digital innovation could have for education globally. And so a lot of us looking at, say, Mission 4.7 are looking for non-cognitive or non-STEM focuses, could have been quite disappointed. But if you actually don't look at the common agenda, and particularly what happened remember, there was 3 big summits of our common agenda. There was the Transforming Education Summit in 2022. Then there was the Midpoint Review last year. And now we've had the Summit of the Future. And then we will have what's called the World Social Summit next year, which is all about, building trust and a new social contract with individuals, whether they're in government or corporates or civil society and so on. And I'm kind of guessing that next year, the whole global citizenship and education will be very, pronounced in the conversations. And the one thing I would take from the Pact of the Future, apart from the HLPF being the body that's responsible for what comes after 2030, starting when it's under the auspices of the General Assembly in 2027, it did actually make a reference to the political declaration that the Irish and Qatari government negotiated last year, and they got 193 countries signing up to a recommitment to the SDGs. And within that, there is a very formal statement about education and particularly Mission 4.7, and a reference to implementing all the recommendations of the TESS Summit, which was the previous year, right? So if I kind of take that as a package, I'm kind of going, the mandate for education is good, and it'll be even more reinforced next year, even if we maybe are a bit disappointed with a text analysis of the Pact for the Future. But this was about governance predominantly, you know what I mean? We had a standalone summit for education, so we have to be happy with that. And then this was a standalone one for governance, and they're just kind of the big enablers of this SDG agenda. Okay, so that was just one of the first points. In terms of where we're going with the Academy, so the Academy obviously has 50 online courses, MOOCs on edX and other platforms, but let's say edX is the main one. It's had this year 1 million learners. We've hit that benchmark. And we have moved a little bit to professional certs on that platform and the master's pathway with UCD, for example. But I guess the big focus for us at the moment, and it could be interesting for the networks, is that we want to mobilize content into use, so into degrees in universities, into LMSs of governments who are doing HR runs or capacity building runs or upskilling runs with their employees. The same with corporates who are actually doing sustainability upskilling on ESG and to bring it into their HR run. And to do that, we actually have to work in partnerships with, let's say, people who are giving accreditation. So, for example, it might be of interest that if you look at the Irish government, they give a CPD to teachers in Ireland, and they give a bit of time off, and they pay for, professional development. And of course, our master's pathway is actually part of that, right? So if teachers want to do that cert, they'll actually get time off. It doesn't cost, I think it's only $120. It doesn't cost that much, but it would be paid for, right? So that's an example of incentivizing workers, whether they're in government or corporates or civil society, to actually upskill and go back to school and actually try and learn something about nature and society and this SDG agenda, etc. Right? So anyone in the networks, who want to deploy this knowledge into their own LMSs for coursework, what I mean is, Blackboard, Brightspace, Canvas, or whatever you use, or want to actually bring it into a HR run in the university, because actually we've done this across lots of universities where all employees actually had to do sustainability training. It wasn't just try to embed it in actual coursework. We have experience of all of this, right? So we have kind of shifted towards a little bit professional training and a little bit to care about how stuff is incentivized or certified for people to use the resource, rather than having just a free open resource that people can do, which it is. And the last thing I'll point to is that we do have 2 million minutes or something in the library filmed. Just think of it as stock material. And if you get a password to that, you can actually download any video you want and any segment, and you can embed it into your course. So it's a way of, it doesn't have the homeworks or exercises, or the PowerPoints, but it does have the videos that you can actually just take and repurpose it if you want to. So I'll leave it to Anne. I know Anne used a little bit of the SDG Academy in her new book, but I'll turn it over to her.
Okay, to go back to some of the points that David raised, first of all, in terms of peacemaking capacity, I think we really need to, think about SDG 16. And I think, in the whole instance of the Middle East now, we're not kind of highlighting SDG 16 enough. And I think a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about peace studies and peace education, and we need to refocus our emphasis on peace education. The other point that I think it's important for all of us, that we cannot be complacent in terms of the SDGs and how they're perceived. And I'm witnessing a very strong backlash now to the SDGs, especially among the academic community. There's a lot of skepticism out there. There's a lot of people who are very, very critical of the SDGs and do not want to engage with them. So while people maybe in this virtual meeting are very committed to the SDGs, I think we cannot afford to be complacent. We need to be aware of this backlash, and we need to have strategies to deal with it. The other issue that came up, the whole thing of AI and new technology. I think new technology can be wonderful and it can be a curse. And I think the points that Paul made in terms of the SDG Academy and how we can share information and share education resources on virtual platforms is very, very powerful. And then if you see what's happening in the likes of Twitter and in the likes of sending out multitude negative critical messages and what that is doing to people's mindset. And I'll give you an example. I saw a couple of interviews recently, very much engineered by the far right. They were with parents talking about the way education is going. And there was this particular person just saying, how parents are being, how the education agenda has been taken away from parents, and parents are being brainwashed in terms of transgender education, in terms of Black Lives Matter, and in all of these things. They were saying that the parents don't have a say, and all of these agendas are being pushed on parents and pushed on schools. And then the interviewer kind of said, where is this coming from? And the person being interviewed said, well, it's actually coming from the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now that made me smile, but this perspective is out there. And I just think we need to be very, very wary of that. So this is an example of technology creating misinformation and disinformation and spreading it rapidly, absolutely rapidly. So it's becoming part of a new narrative. The other issue that David raised, that whole issue of finance. You know, we need finance to move this agenda forward. And if we think in terms of the inequality of finance in the world today between the rich and the poor and the billionaires, and you know the lack of tax on billionaires and all that side of things. So we need political buy-in on that. But even if you look at the money that's being spent on war at the moment, the sheer waste of money that could be used to, you know, support the core elements of Agenda 30. So that's a big issue, and we need to look at the financing side of things. The other strand that David mentioned there was the strong intergenerational equity, that you know, providing support and bridges between the generations. And I think that's really, really important. And I had the opportunity of meeting one of the students from the Irish Secondary Schools Union recently, and she's on the Department of Education ESD forum. And she made a very interesting point. She said, I'm a student, I'm in school, and the department have their meetings from 2 to 4 on a Friday afternoon. I'm missing my school time to attend those meetings. And I thought that was a very interesting illustration of how young people can be excluded from the debate. They're invited, their name is at the table, but they're missing out on school time. But they have to make a choice. So this particular student's parents were very unhappy, as I would be, if my daughter was taking time off from school to attend, you know, a very, very important department meeting. So that's a really good example. And finally, then the whole issue of Mission 4.7. I had the pleasure of attending the Mission 4.7 event in New York, and again, lots of really, really interesting initiatives happening there. So what I would look for, I would try and have more collaboration, more sharing of information. There's a lot of interesting work happening in Ireland. I think we need to share and collaborate with partners overseas. I think we need to focus more in terms of SDGs 17 partnership. We're working too much in silos. I have produced a book on teaching the Sustainable Development Goals to young citizens. There's a free Padlet to go with that book. I'm hoping to reach out to schools. It's a big job, though, because if you don't have buy-in from the department, if you don't have support, with key partners, if you don't have support, that material won't go to school. So I'm trying to think creatively. We're organising a launch in Galway here, and I'm trying to bring on the county councils, the university, the ATU. We're trying to have a joint partnership launch to really get the message across that we have to work collaboratively. There's no point in us all competing with each other for funds, working in silos. We need to work collaboratively to get this agenda moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And if you don't know, Anne just sort of was invited in on the spur of the moment. So thanks for that quick intervention. And one thing I'd just like to add is I did a little research on SciVal on the partners, and basically looking at the number of publications and how they related to SDGs. Health and medicine, the most number of publications, no surprise given the funding levels and everything. But the ones that had the most number of citations, which is a rudimentary form of impacts, was collectively and individually amongst our universities was SDG 16. So that really is something to think about, how we're having global impact across our universities on the world stage in this area. And with that, also when we were getting the materials together for this side event, we found out that pretty much all the SDSN Ireland members have some degree program in peace studies, whether it's undergraduate or up through PhD. And there are also a number of peace institutes, such as the George Mitchell Institute up in Queens, and I think Trinity as well, and I also believe at UCD on that one. So I think this is something that could be harnessed. And as it was said earlier, we're not achieving the SDGs if we can't achieve SDG 16. So I'd like to move forward now to our next two speakers who are going to present together, because they're the deputy co-chairs of SDSN Ireland. They were also over in New York for these events. And they've also each agreed to sort of, help organize thematic lines within SDSN Ireland. Brian O'Gallagher on sort of that area around policy and the bridging the gaps between the research and the policy, and Michael Alcorn on arts and sustainability. So, and yes, I'm happy to share that SciVal information, Michael. And so they're both sort of leads in their universities on sustainability, where Brian is the Associate Vice President of Sustainability, and Michael is the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor of Sustainability and Strategic Projects. So I'll turn it over to them to really bring home what happened sort of with these side events and pre-summit events and the SDSN events, and what they mean for us really moving forward as a network. I don't know who wants to go first there. I'll give it to you, leave that to you guys.
Brian, why don't you start?
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thanks, John, and good afternoon to everyone. I suppose we're going to change tack a bit in a sense, building on what John's introduction, and speak more then about network activities associated with the outcome of the SDSN meetings as distinct from the Summit of the Future. And the SDSN meetings that took place in the same time period as the preparations for the Summit of the Future, from my perspective, were excellent. I mean, what we have is 1,900 universities working together and working in their own locations to try and essentially mobilize societal support, bring the capacity and the knowledge and the convening power of the university out into society to progress the SDGs. And it was really great then to meet SDSN network members from other countries. I see Maria here on the call from Portugal, and to find out what they're doing in their own countries, and it kind of reinforced to us really the approach that we're adopting here and developing in SDSN Ireland. It is working well in the sense that the things we're doing and the things we're focusing on were well received, and also our plans going forward. And I suppose there's 4 dimensions to those plans, and we've discussed these amongst the members, and be interesting to get any additional reflections from others on these. But in terms of 4 areas where we can make a difference, I suppose one is the education for sustainable development, and Paul and Anne have both spoken about that. There's the area of arts and sustainability, and Michael will speak more to that one. And then there's 2 other areas, one on this science policy interface. And I had the opportunity to present at the International Conference on Sustainable Development, which took place as part of the SDSN events, about some of the work that we've been doing on trying to bridge the gap between the research ecosystem and the policy system in the context of energy and climate in particular. And I think the interesting thing is it became very apparent during the COVID period that the role of science and how that can be used to inform policy was critically important, but there was a light shone on it in a way that hasn't been there before. And in an Irish context, we see really positive developments in government departments, setting up evidence for policy units, setting up research groups, and looking to, from their perspective, to bridge between science and policy. And I think that puts the onus on us in the universities to do our part to improve how we bridge between science and policy. So that's one area. And the other one then is engage research, where we actually co-produce research with societal actors. I mean, the policy system is one, but industry is another, and also citizens and communities. And this is another area that's really gained traction, I think, in an Irish context. So those 4 areas, I really took home a strong message from our colleagues across the SDSN community, that those 4 areas that we're focusing on in Ireland: education for sustainable development, linking the arts with sustainable development, bridging between science and policy in sustainable development, and engage research around sustainable development, that we're on the right track. It was well received, and I suppose to let the Irish members of SDSN know, we have the support of the international SDSN community in what it is that we're doing. So I'll finish on that and pass over to Michael. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Just to echo everything that Brian said, I think the two of us had been 2 years earlier. It was our first time attending, and it was really interesting just to get a sense of where we position ourselves in that kind of international space. We came away 2 years ago thinking that was something we needed to really clarify. And I think it's fair to say that when we presented those 4 areas in discussion with other networks and I guess the overarching SDSN executive, it was felt that what we're trying to do is ambitious but distinctive, which we felt was very important for us. So I think also, as Anne pointed out, obviously our priority is to deliver on the SDGs across the island, but we learn a lot from those collaborations with other partners, and I think that's it's those side discussions at an event like this that are really important. And meeting colleagues from Portugal was a particularly notable and enjoyable part of being there. And I think from that, we start to see where there are opportunities for perhaps larger international sub-themes emerging. And indeed, for the next few minutes, I'll just say a few words about the arts and sustainability side, because as you know, in our own member discussions, we agreed that would be something of a priority for us. And in talking to some of the other networks, there's quite a number of those networks who'd be interested to, I guess, share ideas and thoughts about the impact of a kind of arts and sustainability approach around climate communication. So in terms of, Brian and I both spoke, just to give there was a session one afternoon, which was kind of snapshots of things we thought were working well. Brian presented some of his energy related work. I also just talked briefly about arts and sustainability, touching on the fact that there were really good examples of work going on right across our institutions on the island. I think we all agreed that this is an area that we should be distinctive at, and something which is fundamental to a lot of our own academic institutions and many of our practicing artists. We highlighted that there are festivals or other programs being developed across institutions, including Queen's, where I'm based, Southeast Technological University, UCC, University of Galway, University of Limerick, and I'm sure other things at all our institutions. So even within our own SDSN Ireland, we want to, I guess, pull together a subgroup to try and look about, let's try and understand what we're doing collectively and what can we share across that piece. The thing I would just highlight really was the value of doing this. 2 years ago when we were there at this event, I think I was really struck by how much scientific evidence there is and this repeated plea that nobody's listening, and how do we communicate with people. And the only thing I could really think of, well, there is a real role and a really unique role for the arts in doing this in a very special way. So I guess the context for all of this is how are the arts and cultural practices amplifying climate issues in the SDGs? Can artistic approaches succeed when scientific communication perhaps struggles? What's distinctive about what we do in Ireland in relation to the climate crisis and the SDGs? And how are all the stakeholders, the funding bodies, the artists, the promoters, how do they see this, and where are the opportunities and the barriers? And how do we make sure that arts practice isn't just window dressing, that it's that we're bringing our artists into something which for them too is very challenging and allows them to present challenging and innovative arts practice. So as I say, that was just a very short snapshot of what we talked about and presented at this. And I used our own Reach Festival, which we launched this year in Queen's, just as an example of the types of activities from across Ireland that we showcased at our festival this year that I think illustrate all those points that I've just mentioned about why we should be doing this. And I think on the back of that, there will be further discussions across other networks and, of course, within our own network in the weeks ahead. And apologies, I'm full of the cold since I got back from New York. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael and Brian. And yes, I think one of the strengths of SDSN is this global network of networks that we can leverage for collaboration, upscaling of ideas, and learning from. And from what I'm seeing with the European managers especially, is that there's a strong interest in what we're doing here in Ireland, and this idea of sustainability in the arts is gaining more and more traction. So at this point, in answer to your question, Michael, I tried to share that SciVal information here, but it's not allowing me to set an attachment. So I'll forward that out probably to the wider members group so we can see that. And so I guess at this point, I don't see any other questions in the chat stream, but does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? And please, in the interest of time, just keep your questions short so we can get around the table. Okay, well, if maybe I'll just go ahead and put one question out there to David, because you sort of set yourself up on that when you were saying about sort of the future of the SDGs, and even what SDGs might be added, because I think I've heard rumblings of arts and culture actually even being considered as an SDG in the future. Oh, and you're muted, David. You're still muted.
Okay, now that should be
thanks.
okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes. Well, there were rumours that there could be an extra goal added the next time round on arts and culture as enablers of sustainable development. But more generally, you know, the remarkable thing is on the one hand, that the level of implementation of the SDGs is of course very low. It's only around 15% of targets, of the 169 targets, being on track, and in several cases we're in reverse with the targets. So the level of implementation measured that way is not very encouraging. On the other hand, what is undeniable is, and I was interested in what Anne said about what she had picked up, but you know, insofar as one can judge from the formal UN gatherings which take place every year in the high-level political forum, the level of enthusiasm for the SDGs is higher than ever. I mean, one way of measuring that is that every country is expected to come and give its national report, its so-called voluntary national review. And the truth is that we are now at about 189, 190 countries out of the 193, and many of them have come several times. Now, there are one or two conspicuous omissions, notably the US, but apart from that, practically every country has come at least once to report on its progress. So there is a real sense that the SDGs are considered the right way forward, and frankly, in my view, they are here to stay one way or another. And I was actually quite taken by remarks made by the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, who in effect expressed the same view. She believes that there is no question of renegotiating the SDGs, that by implication they will be built on, they'll be expanded, they'll be refined in various ways. But what we're not going to do is go back to the drawing board, throw these out and start from scratch. There is enough consensus that we got it on the whole right in 2015. Now, obviously, when it comes to considering a new agenda, which might turn out to be very similar to the present one, there will be, on the one hand, lots of proposals for improvements, strengthening, additions, etc. but I have to warn that there'll also be proposals to weaken it, to take things away, to in effect undermine it. Not that those proposals will carry the day, but there will be an attempt made by countries, for example, whose human rights commitments are questionable. They will, I think, try to eat away or erode what we agreed in 2015. They won't be in a majority, but they will definitely make an effort, I think. So we have to be conscious of that risk. But on the whole, I think countries will come with proposals to add to the 17. Now, I mean, I don't see it. I don't see us getting to 35 or 40 goals. That's just not practical. But I personally think you could end up with 21, let's say, without undermining the whole project. Where we have at present a goal which covers multiple areas, you could imagine that being divided into 2 separate goals, etc. But it's perhaps easier not to talk in terms of goals, but rather what are the themes or the topics which up to now have or which are now perceived to be very relevant to implementation of the SDGs, but which perhaps didn't get enough attention several years ago. So one of them is the whole question of digitalization and how we can use new technologies to almost leapfrog in many countries, in many economies, that we can actually fast forward progress because of what AI and other technologies give us. So I think that would be a theme somehow. It might be a theme of the declaration that goes with the goals, but it may not be a goal as such, because it's more an enabler. Another thing I think which could feature is more attention to migration worldwide as an enabler, a positive enabler of sustainable development. Too often we think of, or if you like, migration is represented as a threat, an obstacle, but the truth is that so many people in the world have a migratory background. They are economic migrants who move from one country to another. In themselves, they are enablers of sustainable development. So look, I can see about 4 or 5 extra topics. Another one would be, this is quite an important one, I think more guidance for countries in understanding how the goals interconnect with each other, what are called the synergies and the trade-offs. So are there, governments should be constantly thinking of ways in which their individual decisions could impact several goals simultaneously in a positive sense. They could also, of course, have a negative impact. They could be an obstacle to implementation. But that whole concept of getting beyond silo thinking and understanding how the goals interact with each other, I think we would probably end up having a lot more about that in the future agenda. But this is just speculation on my part. But I was interested that at the level of the Deputy Secretary General, and she's very close to this, that there was no question of saying that we will have a new set of goals, that in effect we have the present set, which will be refined to one degree or another. And that, I think, will be the future agenda. Now, as to what timeline that might cover, I should say that the SDSN itself, about 6 months ago, issued a lengthy statement which proposed content for the Pact of the Future. And one line in that talked about 2050 as the possible future deadline. That's to say that we would go for a 20-year agenda just to give ourselves a bit more time. I could see something like that happening. I think that it won't necessarily be 15. It could be a little bit longer. But the truth is that's we were perhaps being over ambitious in imagining that we could have achieved all the goals, all the targets in 15 years. But I think something very like the present agenda will be the one that we have from 2030 on.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions? Don't be shy. Okay, Maria Zhao.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me for such an interesting meeting. I find that it's really inspiring to do something like this, and you gave me immediately the idea that we do this with our leadership council also, because then they have a more clear idea about how things are and what happened in New York, really. But I wanted to come back a little bit to these discussions we had that Brian raised in the network chairs, because I find that this is very important. I think that we are really not taking the advantage or maximized advantage from the enormous potential and knowledge that exists in SDSN with all the networks. And I think that one way of improving this is what was suggested about these hubs that are entrusting some networks, and that we can work together around these teams. And like this, we are a little bit closer to each other in these concrete teams, and we exchange more and we can develop more further. And this, I defend very much this idea. I liked very much this proposal. And I think that we should really begin to go for it. Actually, we began already in Paris, John, to discuss a little bit about this, we call it territorialization, but it's localization, I think, of the SDGs and how to support the local level to improve the implementation of the SDGs as a bottom-up process to make this come over more for acceleration of this implementation. And we could see that we are very much working on this. We have already 2 cities here in the north and 3 cities and 2 universities that we are coming now to the organization of the project. We saw that our colleagues of Spain are even a little bit more further, have already something put in practice. You are, from the presentation Brian did, I could see that you are also working in this perspective. And so I think that we could really begin to structure some ideas about how to cooperate around this. And the other thing, and I had several talks with Amber, for instance, because I think that to do this, and we can use also the resources that exist in the SDG Academy also, so that we can cooperate. And this is really a way of taking advantage and synergizing all the potential that we have inside the whole network.
Thank you, Maria João. Does anybody have a comment from the panel they would like to make on that? Or we have about 4 minutes left. Yeah. Oh, Paul?
Yeah, no, I'd like to just go back to something that Anne was saying about the SDGs and nationalism. So, like, obviously this agenda, when you look at it, you know, when I compare the Paris Agreement to the SDGs, it's about cooperation across nations, and it's about multilateralism and even the whole Pact of the Future was all about putting trust, and even next year it's about putting trust and faith back into multilateralism. And the reality is that, you know, when it comes to our global environmental commons, we can't restore the health of the ocean, our food systems, our climate without cooperating. I mean, that ship has gone. You know, there's no way we can go back into our nation states and not cooperate on that, you know. And when I'm hearing Michael and others, I mean, I actually think the strength of SDSN, but what's actually quite necessary is that the academy or scientists do act as a little bit of a shadow multilateralism. So what actually is important in what we do, and even if it's in these hubs, is to actually cooperate across countries. So if we actually can show people like how you do education, how you do research, how you know, that actually this is cooperation across countries, I think this is important. So even for SDSN, you know, country networks or SDSN institutions themselves to be kind of a bit in their silo or in their country is probably a mistake. like the big opportunity here, and the one that works, is if we actually cooperate across nations, and to show how that works. So I just wanted to induce that, because I think it will be a big feature of this world social contract, that we have to respect. And it's not we want to impose our beliefs on other cultures. If anything, what we want to do is experience other cultures and to actually learn from each other, and to really be aware. So I think there's a lack of global citizen education, and that so many people are not fully aware of all the joys and things you can learn across different countries of the world. And you'd be very surprised if you went into language or arts or cultures or stuff, what you would pull out. So I know I'm overemphasizing it. So universities should be twinning with other universities in least developed countries. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, everything you're doing should be about reaching out as a nation state to actually have cooperation across the world, so that we can all experience the joys of cultures and others, but more importantly, that we protect people and planet. And we can't do that within our own nation states. So I think there is a bit of a battleground between sovereignty and global cooperation, to be honest, and it's appearing in our politics. But we have to try and explain to people that this is not the way forward if we want to survive as a species on this planet, basically.
Well said, Paul. And just a quick question here, it looks like from Catherine Omani. Are the European University Alliances useful vehicles? And I would say yes. Practically all our SDSN Ireland members, their universities are also part of a European University Alliance. And this is something I've been trying to bring into the agenda of SDSN Europe, which is an overarching network of the European managers. So yes to that. And I think we've got 1 minute left, so I don't know if anybody has a quick word, but what I'd like to just say is thanks to everybody, thanks to our presenters, and and thanks for everybody for being here.